dig mountains with the edges of your hip bones. Sculpt temples from the softness of your lips. Make homes for the sacredness of your stories. Your body is home. Your body is an island. Your body is home. Your body is the ocean. Hi, my name is Mackerel and I'm a Mauritian Canadian multidisciplinary artist and writer living in Dijage, also known as Montreal, and this is ZOM-FAM, my debut poetry collection. Your body is home. Your body is an island. Your body is home. Your body is the ocean. I work in performance, in poetry, in visual art, in installation, and I love working across media to be able to find multiple ways, multiple points of access to articulate ideas, feelings, moods, politics, aesthetics. Yeah, so I really love working in interdisciplinary processes. ZOM-FAM started actually as a creative process that was not meant for the page. I didn't know in the beginning that I would be writing a book. There are 8 pieces in the book because they're long lyric poems, and each of the pieces were initially written as separate spoken word pieces. I wrote them as like 10 to 12 minute spoken word pieces, and it's only with time that I realized that through each of the separate pieces there was actually a storyline. There was something else that I was trying to articulate. There was a deeper story that was asking to emerge from that process. That's when I started working on ZOM-FAM, the show actually, which is a 75-minute show, and it was only after I started preparing this manuscript for the stage that I realized, oh, there's also space to turn this manuscript into some form of experiment that could exist on the page. So the ZOM-FAM as a book, as a poetry collection, came at a later point in the process. But from the very beginning, though, the poetry, the performance piece and the spoken word pieces were written as poetry. But I didn't know or think at the time when I started that they would also become a book by the end of it. Her dreams hummed like an engine as a sugarcane factory worked day and night to produce more and more and more for 1 extra rupee, for 2 extra rupee, for 3 extra rupees. Her dreams smelled thick like the lingering scent of molasses fogging our encampment as the sugarcane got crushed. The stout liquid oozed out and glazed our mornings, our evenings with its smell. There is ZOM-FAM, the show, the 75 minutes interdisciplinary piece of my body moving on stage where there's rituals and dance and movements and voice, and the poetry is in motion, and then there's ZOM-FAM, the book. I think both of them accompany each other. I think they are twin projects, but they also exist separately from each other, as in, like, you could read the book on its own without seeing the show, or you could see the show on its own without reading the book. But I think each of them give different points of entry into engaging with the work and what this work is trying to do in terms of articulating a decolonial queer poetics. If you see the show, you get to see the life of the poetry come to life through movement, through body, and you get to see it move through space, but the temporality of it is within the 75 minutes of the show. Once the show is over, it's over. Whereas the book allows you a different kind of point of entry, because you get to read it in your own pace, right? Like, if you want to take 3 months to read this book, it will last 3 months. Also, at the same time, one of the things that I tried to do with the book is, because I was very intentional with how each of the word, every single line in the book and the way it's placed on the page was something that was very intentional, and for me that was, it was part of trying to bring the performative experience onto the page. I wanted the body of the text to also perform on the page. So there's also that aspect of the book. I think both of them emerge from the same material, same interdisciplinary process, same question, like the questions that I was asking myself, that I wanted to research and explore as an artist. But then in terms of a product, so to speak, yeah, the book circulates in a particular way, right? Like the book can circulate around independent of COVID-19, whereas the performance cannot happen within a context where crowds cannot gather in theaters. So I think they're just different media. I am a pilgrim with a silver spear pierced through my tongue, betel leaf between my toes, saffron on the armor of my skin, ash over my devotional eye, a palcadum on my head. I travel across oceans, I travel across genders, I travel across oceans, I travel across genders. ZOM-FAM actually means man, woman in Mauritian Kreol, and it's one term, and it can be translated as many things. It can be translated as gay man, as effeminate gay man, as trans woman, as trans femme, as transgender. It means multiple things, and the reason why I wanted the title to be in Creole is because that's what the book does. The book goes back to the story of that queer child growing up on the plantation island, and really unpacks the complexity of being descendant of slaves, of being descendant of the indenture, of growing up on the plantations, and what that did from generation to generation. How do you find language? How do you find a term? How do you find ways of actually expressing your gendered experience? And that's what ZOM-FAM is about. It's a reclamation of that term. It's a celebration of that term as a way of being, a gendered way of being that actually exists outside of Western frameworks of gender and sexuality. And this is really the poetics that drives the book. The story goes that I was born on a day that was muffin. On that hot midsummer day, the southeast wind stopped blowing. The sun's burn stagnated high over the smothered flesh of the island. Heat rose from the ocean in sheets of vapor, distorting the island into dreamlike landscapes. On that day, the moon was plump and orange, high above the horizon, mirroring the sun against the skin of the sky. Yeah, so I've been writing since I was a teenager, really. Like many teenagers, I wrote really sad, depressing poetry throughout the age of 15 till the age of 24, 25 maybe. I was no longer a teenager then, but I was still writing sad poetry. I dabbled with all sorts of writing. I worked as a journalist for a point of time. I was a blogger for many, many years. Like I really explored in terms all over the years to find what is it that was my voice. With this project specifically, it was when I started writing for the stage, I started writing spoken word pieces. I really feel that the past 15 years of my life has been just an ongoing writing practice in any kind of genre, you know, in journalistic genres, in like nonfiction and poetry and writing for the stage, like really finding what is my voice, what is my artistic voice, what is it that I'm trying to say in a voice that feels like it resonates and it's truly authentically mine. My father woke up before sunrise the next morning. He shaved, showered, applied a smear of vibhuti on his forehead. He grabbed the platter of offerings he had prepared the night before: bananas, coconut, milk, rose water, saffron, marigolds, honey, camphor, gato cocoa. And he rushed to the Mauritian Kreol. He passed the peacocks perched on mango trees, roosting in the precinct of the temple. He entered the courtyard, removed his sandals, rinsed his feet,
circled the temple 3 times, breathed deeply, and finally stepped across the doorway as the first light of the day washed over the sculpted eyes of 1,001 gods. Why poetry? Because it's my first love, and it's just one of those love stories. Like the flame never died. I think, yeah, I mean, I read a lot of poetry, you know, and I think it kind of makes sense that then I write poetry. But I'm very interested in narrative form. I also read a lot of fiction. I'm very interested in storytelling. I think that's the word. Like, I'm very interested in storytelling, and what I did with ZOM-FAM really, it's a merging of the storytelling with poetry, because I'm actually telling all the stories through a poetic form. So I was always very interested in long form poems specifically. I don't know, there's just something that I like about it. It's just a personal preference. Like, I love reading short form, but I love writing long form, because I guess I'm somebody who loves going into the detail, who loves stories that go round and round and round before you ever actually get to the punchline. I really love those, so I love writing long form, which is why all of those are long form poems. You know, particularly in an age of Twitter, right? Like, where our poetry is supposed to be under 150 characters, where there is so much Insta poetry, and there's nothing wrong with that. And I couldn't restrict myself to the Insta poetry. I wanted long form poem. I like poetry that fills. Right, like it's like having I don't know, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 course meal, and it slowly builds up, and it slowly fills you, and it slowly gives you different tastes and different nuances and different smells and different colors, and over that it builds. In my case, it builds with a story, and by the end of it, you're like, I'm full. I have eaten a full meal, and there's been like all those nuances that actually came into creating that feeling of fullness. I think that's a way of describing my relationship to poetry. I honor Kamla, whose ceremonial fingers enchant the dead and bring their spirits back to life. Uma, whose visions speak in femme tongues long forgotten. Lalita, whose sword flows like rivers longing for a sea to call home. Asha, whose ancestral lungs carry curses that quiver like crackles of burning sandalwood. Devika, whose grief is cavernous like a sinuous passage in the night sky. I don't think there were any particular writers that I was necessarily trying to emulate or anything like this. I read a lot of poetry. Like, I read what my peers are writing. I read in English, I read in French, I read short form poetry, long form poetry, a lot of poetry. And I think that nurtures me. I think the most influential part for me was probably the many spoken word artists that I've witnessed performing over the years. Like, I've seen so many of them, you know, even in open mics and all sorts of events. And I think hearing people use poetry to tell their story, I think that was the bigger influence on the process of writing this book. You are the child of lineages of ceremonial femmes who dreamt you up, reshaped the universe so they could give birth to you. A promise, a celebration, an offering, a pact, an omen, an earthen lamp on your ancestors' altar, molten lava exploding in the belly of a volcano, roaring fire at sunset, echoes of Ravan, Maravan, Trekpiang, craquement du bois qui a pu brûler, qui peut monter là-haut, côte nous bandes ancêtres, côte noiroute nous bandes histoires, ban grand du monde qui continue vivre dans nous l'équerre, ban ZOM-FAM qui continue vivre dans nous la veine. I think the most challenging process of writing ZOM-FAM has been writing my truth. I think there's something about writing a story as truthfully as you can requires you to step into your fears. And very much so with this process.
particularly within the context, because I write Mauritius within it. I write my family history into it. I write my own life trajectory into it. And the process of doing that requires you to be truthful, and a lot of times it's easier to tell ourselves stories about ourselves and others. It's easier to lie to ourselves. We all do it, and I think in the process of writing those pieces, I wanted to get to the heart of the truth and try to write a story that's as truthful as possible within the context where I was, and the subjectivity and the time space that I was at the time when I was writing. And I think that was the hardest part. I'm absolutely in love with this cover, I have to say, and really I wanted a cover that captures the different forms of texture and text that are interweaved throughout the poetry, because I was very intentional in terms of articulating my own aesthetics to allow different forms of texturality, and that comes from my interdisciplinary approach to art making in that sense, right? Like, 'cause the book is also a visual object, it's also a performative object, and I wanted those textures to come to life. So this work of art was actually made by Only and Kayunting, two very good friends of mine. This was actually a textile piece that they painted on, that they weaved on, collaged on, and then that textile piece was transposed into a photograph that became the cover. And I also really love that it's a textile piece because it honors the femme. Like, I think the fabric and clothing and textures, generally femme textures, generally speaking, are very present in throughout the poetry. And I wanted that I also work with textiles. I'm also a textile artist, so I loved that it was actually a textile piece that came to life. And also I love the landscape of Mauritius, really. I think it honors ZOM-FAM as the character. I love that relationship to the land, to the island specifically, that's happening on that cover. So yeah, I'm very much in love with this cover. I think it's absolutely beautiful, and I'm very, very, very grateful that I got two of my best femme besties who designed this. Working with Metonymy Press has been absolutely dreamy. I have so much gratitude to Ashley and Oliver, but also to the extended family at Metonymy Press, because really that's what Metonymy Press is. It's an extended family. Given that most of this book for me was actually written in Montreal, and as I said, given that those were written initially as spoken word pieces that I had the chance to present in different open mics and different events, so there's a huge, the queer community of Montreal, especially the queer cutie BIPOC community of Montreal, has seen different bits and pieces of what became this book over the years. And it was really important to me that this book then gets published with an indie publisher in this city who is committed to creating spaces for queer and trans voices, as a way of grounding the book in the location where it was born. Even if the book is about Mauritius, it was predominantly written here. Of grounding it also within that broader queer community that I've surrounded myself with over the years, and that absolutely nurtured my process. And there's also just something about feeling like you're publishing your first book, but also feeling like you're joining a family. And that was the part that was more important for me. And I'm so excited, I'm so grateful, I'm super happy that this book got published with Metonymy Press, and the process of working together has been absolutely amazing. It's been absolutely dreamy, and it feels like such an honor for me to be part of the Metonymy Press family now. And I invoke strength and wisdom from Goddess Kalima, Redeemer of the universe, Goddess of time, change and destruction, Goddess with charcoal eyes and a blood tongue who cuts patriarchy and wears it as a garland around her neck. Goddess with matted hair and ivory fangs, who dismembers misogyny and wraps it as a skirt around her waist. That lineage, past, present and future, the women and femmes who reshape the universe, I invoke and I honor.